Hi friends, it's Bonnie here. Welcome back to Crafty Meraki's channel. This mixed media card incorporates a number of products including the Luminous Leaves Effortless Shimmer paper, Artisan Flora dies, Wreath, and also the newly released Marrakech Mosaic Cover Die. Mixed media is so much fun, dabbling with a little bit of this and a little bit of that, so let's get started. Mixed media is all about layering on beautiful textures, and I'm going to start off with some ink smooshing on one of the designer sheets from Luminous Leaves. I'll be working with positively saturated inks, and the first color that I'm applying is a bright pink called Carnation. I like to apply one color at a time so that I can evenly distribute the color across the panel. Now I'm going to be applying a very deep gray purple called Petunia. I'm not sure how much moisture this paper can withstand, so I'm being careful in applying just light spritzes of water. Right now my panel is oversized so that when I'm finished this technique, I can choose the area that I like best to cut it down to A2 size, 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches. Additional texture will be layered on with white texture paste. The stencil was created with the Marrakech Mosaic Cover Die. The cover die was used to cut a heavy weight of cardstock. I'm using 110-pound weight of Neenah Classic Crest. Rather than stenciling the entire panel, the texture will be applied randomly. Because I'm coming right off the panel's edge, I thought, I better get some paper towel under there to protect my work surface. There are lots of different tools out there for applying this paste. I like to use a cheap plastic palette knife. I find that it is nice and flexible and easy to work with, and I really like the narrow nose on this one. I can get right into that corner without the texture paste spilling out over the edges. With the random application of the stencil, I find that the offset handle of the palette knife gives me a lot of control. Now that I'm done, I'll just use my finger and clean up the edges of the panel. To help define the texture that I just applied, I'm going to use Tattered Rose Distress Stain. Just be applied to the areas where I've stenciled, and when it dries, the ink smooshing texture will still show through. And to move along the drying process, I'll use my heat tool. The sentiment for this card will be cut using the scripty die from the Meraki Moments Hugs die set. I want the color of the sentiment to coordinate with that in the background, so I'll use the same ink pads, Carnation and Petunia, and just drag them across white cardstock. This is a really pretty combination, but I think that the Hugs sentiment is going to blend a little bit into the background, so I'm going to pop it up onto black sheet foam to really help it to stand out. When die cutting foam for stacking the sentiment, I do not remove the excess right away. I'll use liquid adhesive and apply that to the scripty foam letters. And as you can see, I am applying a thin stream, but I'm not being particularly careful. The foam die cut letters will be slightly depressed. This makes it very easy to align the cardstock ones to it. However, it won't stay aligned if the excess foam is removed right away, so it's set aside to dry completely. And so now I can go ahead and prepare my flowers for the panel using the Artisan Flora dies Wreath. As you can see, I'm continuing to color my cardstock with that very laborious and difficult method of dragging the Carnation ink pad across the white cardstock. Before I do my third flower and the leaves, I'm first going to assemble these two flowers. The flower centers will be darkened up with a very dark purple ink called Aster. I'll be using 3 different flowers from this set, and the first 2 that I'm working on right now have 2 petal layers. After the fact, it was clear that those two petal layers were blending together too much, so I'm using that blending brush with the aster on it to add a little bit of color to that bottom layer. And then it's finished off by adding in the flower centers. For all of the flowers, I just do a little bit of hand shaping to give them some nice dimension. Now for the second flower, that bottom layer is going to be inked before I assemble it. And I'm just using the ink that was left over from the blender brush that was used to ink the flower centers. I'm not adding any additional ink. And there's flower number 2 complete. The third flower will provide some contrast to the first two flowers by being out of a much darker tone. The cardstock is prepared in the exact same way, and I'll start off by dragging carnation across the panel. And this time I'm going to use a much darker ink called Aster. The side of the panel that I've just finished inking is going to be used for the leafy stem. I'm going to add petunia to the other side. This will be for the third flower. And I'll brighten it up a bit by adding another layer of carnation on top. This flower has 3 petal layers, so I'll go ahead and assemble those, and the flower center once again will be inked up with that very dark ink. So I've just colored the stamen layer. I'm going to put that in place, and then I'll use the original color for the actual flower center and pop that in the middle of it. You may have noticed that I did bend those stamens upwards before it was attached to the flower. When the Tattered Rose Distress Stain was applied to the areas where the texture paste was, it did deepen the background, but it did color the paste as well. Using a white pigment ink, I'm just going to rub lightly over the texture paste to brighten it up. And then my panel is ready to be adhered to an A2 size top folding black card base. There are 2 things that I absolutely love to incorporate in all of my cards, and one of them is dimension and the other is lots of sparkle. I'm using a mixed media paintbrush to paint liquid adhesive to the edges of the petal. The mixed media brush has stiffer bristles, making it easier to clean. I'm then going to apply a product called Diamond Dust. This is like little pieces of glass, and they are just so sparkly and gorgeous. And after I've added some sparkle to the tips of the leaves, I'm also going to add some sparkle to the bottom half of each of the letters of the Sentiment Hugs. The adhesive is painted on to keep it smooth. If it was applied directly from the nozzle, you would see all of the ridges when it was dry. And because it's a thin layer of adhesive, it dries quickly. So the first thing that I'm going to adhere to my card front is the sentiment. And adhering anything that is foam backed, it is going to take a little bit longer to dry. And that is precisely what I need so that I can get all of the individual letters in that sentiment aligned. And I appreciate that wiggle room as I hold it up to see if I've got it on straight and fiddle around some more with it. I've snipped my leafy branch in 2 so I have a small pair of leaves to go with the flower that is going to sit above the sentiment. I'm using small foam squares on the leaves themselves and then some adhesive on the stems so that the stem will lay flat against the card and the leaves will pop up. Foam squares will be used on the flower. I'll pop one in the center and then on each alternating petal. When the flower is positioned on the card front, I'll overlap the last 2 letters in the sentiment slightly. I don't want it to detract from the ability to read the sentiment, but what I do want to do is to create that strong focal point in the center of the card because there's so much going on in the background. And once this is in place, then I can go ahead and lay out my other 2 flowers and the leafy stem below the hug sentiment. I have my lighter flower overlapping the darker one, and I'm just going to adhere them together and use my reverse tweezers to hold them in place until it dries. Again, I'll be using the small foam squares, but I'll use them just on the leaves that are at the top of the stem, and then liquid adhesive will be used at the base of the stem and the bottom 2 leaves. I like how this causes the branch to sweep upwards. It also gives me a flat surface to adhere that first flower to. They will also be popped up with foam squares. And again, when I attach the flowers, they're just going to overlap the bottom of the sentiment slightly. I'll just add a few tiny dots of white Nouveau crystal drops to the center of the dark flower. I'm pretty sure that you can see some of the sparkle and shine that is reflecting in the light from the glass glitter that was added to the flowers, leaves, and sentiment. And of course, I have to ramp up the sparkle, so I'm going to be adding in some confetti from a mix that is a combination of rose, peach, and silver. If you have watched any of my videos, you'll know that I can't even stop myself when I use confetti. I have to dig out the Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. I just love it. Right now it's a little bit cloudy, but when it dries, it'll be clear and they'll look like beautiful smooth crystals. That wraps up this pretty mixed media card using Luminous Leaves Effortless Shimmer paper along with the Artisan Flora Dies Wreath. And of course, everything centers around that beautiful sentiment, Meraki Moments Hugs. Let's not forget the dimensional texture that was added using Marrakech Mosaic Cover Die to create a stencil. This was such a fun card to make, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. As always, we appreciate your visit.